Hey there! Thanks for joining me. In case you don't know who I am, my name's Isaac and I'll be the guest speaker today. So, today we're going to be talking about church history and what it looks like when the church starts trying to build its own kingdom versus trying to build the kingdom of God. So, after Jesus' death and resurrection, the church was a tiny minority in the Roman Empire and they were heavily persecuted. For about 300 years after Jesus, millions and millions of Christians were killed by the Roman Emperor just because they were Christians. But after about 300 years of this kind of persecution, the church continued to grow. It grew all throughout the Middle East, into North Africa, and into Europe, throughout Turkey and Greece, which was awesome because the Christians, even though they were persecuted, had a laser-like focus on the gospel and who Jesus was, and that's why the church grew. After this time, after about 300 years, the church got together at its first Ecumenical Council, called the Council of Nicaea. At this council, the church gathered a lot of its leaders together, and they kind of hashed out various things about who God is, who Jesus is, what the Bible should look like, and important decisions like that. Around that time, the Roman emperor named Constantine became a Christian, and the story of how he became a Christian is pretty rad. He was fighting a battle, or he was about to fight a battle, and then he saw a giant cross in the sky, like a blazing light cross of light. And he said, you know what, that's a sign from God. So he told all his men, paint a cross on your shield, and they did that, and then he won the battle. So he said, you know what, God, you helped me win the battle, so I'll become a Christian. So he did. And so after that point, the Christians started gaining a lot of power and influence in the empire instead of being a tiny persecuted minority. And so over time, they started gaining more power, more political office, they started gaining wealth and influence. And while that had some good things to it, it also had a lot of downside to it because the church started getting focused and sidetracked. Instead of focusing on the gospel, it got sidetracked on other worldly concerns like power and wealth. And because of this, cracks started to appear in the church and it became less unified. And after about 700 years of Christians gaining more and more power and wealth, the first great division of the church happened. And this was the division between the Western Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. Basically, the church split along the lines of some people in the East wanted to control people in the West, and people in the West wanted to control people in the East, and they weren't willing to let each other kind of worship God in the way they wanted to worship God because they were looking for power. And so the church decided to split in two. And that was unfortunate, that was sad, but that was caused by power politicking, to be honest. So, after that, the Western Church continued to grow and flourish in Europe, and in fact the majority religion in Europe was Christianity. But the problem was that the church still had a ton of power, to the point where the Pope actually was more powerful than any king or emperor. The Pope controlled all of Europe's armies, the wealth, the land, everything, who was king, who was not king, that was all controlled by the church actually. And so, again, while this might have had some benefits, the downside was that it was actually very hard for the church to distinguish itself from the culture. Because as Christians, we're supposed to be a light in our culture and not just go along with everything our culture does and says. But that's not what the church at this time was doing. In fact, it was getting sucked along with the culture, and instead of being a light, just went along with the culture. So the culture at that time was quite violent. Wars were very common. And so because of that, the church also engaged in a lot of violence and wars. And so you might have heard of things like the Crusades, where Christians fought against Muslims. And so Christians used military power to enforce the gospel by the sword instead of by talking to them. And this, of course, led to a lot of confusion in Christians' minds, like, who is Jesus? What really is the gospel? Is this how the gospel is supposed to be spread? And so even though Christianity was the official majority religion in Europe at this time, it really became stale and old and lost a lot of its power. And so in the 1500s, several men, including a man named Martin Luther in Germany as well as in Switzerland, started to say, hey, the way the church is being corrupted by all this power and wealth and the way that it's being run is not okay. Let's try and change things. And so started the Great Reformation. The Reformation was basically the idea that the church needs to return to its roots, more gospel-centered, and kind of leave behind some of the dead traditions that were being practiced by the church at that time. And so at that was the second great division of the church, was between the Catholic Church and the Protestants. Protestants being the term of people who protested against the Catholic Church. And so that's why today you have all sorts of Christian denominations, is because of the Reformation, where denominations like the Baptists, the Lutherans, the Presbyterians, and all the other ones, a lot of them come from the people who broke away from the Catholic Church at the time of the Reformation. And so, again, good things and bad things came from this. On the plus side, a lot of revitalization of the church happened because of the Great Reformation, and a lot of people saw Jesus for who he really was in a new way. The bad thing was that the violence continued, and instead of fighting outside people, the church turned inward and started killing each other. And for a few hundred years after the Reformation, it was not very uncommon to have Christians massacring other Christians just because of minor differences in their theology. And so, what's the point of all this church history? Why are we talking about it? Well, the question is, whose kingdom are we building? In Matthew 6:33, Jesus said, "Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you." And so when we look back through history, and we see that when the church has obeyed that command and focused on the kingdom of God, the church has thrived and has been unified and has grown. But when the church has gotten sidetracked with wealth and power and prestige, that's when things start to fall apart. And so it's important as a church that we follow Jesus' command and seek God's kingdom first, seek the gospel, and not our own kingdom. But this also applies to us on a personal level. In your life, are you pursuing God's kingdom first, or are you pursuing your own kingdom by building your wealth or prestige or power or whatever that is? All these things that are worldly things are not bad in and of themselves, but they are bad if we're pursuing them instead of pursuing God's kingdom. So my encouragement to you guys is to examine yourselves and see whose kingdom are you building? Are you building your own kingdom, or are you building God's kingdom? And build God's kingdom, because that will end up better. So thanks for joining me. Have a good night.